Good evening. Thank you for being here. I'm Ben Markle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society. Most of you here are familiar with us, but just in case you're not, the Florida Historical Society was established in 1856, making us the oldest existing cultural organization in the state. This is our statewide headquarters here at the Library of Florida History, where we maintain an incredible archive of thousands of rare and out-of-print books, maps dating back to the 1500s, postcards, a genealogical collection, and all of that is archived and maintained by our Director of Educational Resources, Ben Dibiase, who is our speaker tonight, and he'll be with you in just a moment. But this is a really exciting time to be a member of the Florida Historical Society. We have so much going on. In addition to maintaining our archive, we manage the historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens down in O'Galley. We do all sorts of educational outreach with our radio program, Florida Frontiers, the weekly radio magazine of the Florida Historical Society that's heard all over the state. We have a brand new department called the Florida Historical Society Archaeological Institute, which carries on more than a century-long tradition of the Florida Historical Society supporting archaeology in the state, but it's a brand new department dedicated to keeping that tradition going. And Dr. Rachel Wenz, who you all know, is director of FHSAI. We have all sorts of great educational outreach throughout the state. We just had our annual meeting and symposium in Fort Lauderdale. Our annual meeting is in a different Florida city every year, and it was in Fort Lauderdale this year, and the theme was La Française en Floride, Cultural and Historical Influences, the French in Florida, which is our theme tonight as well. As I said, it's really an exciting time to become a member of the Florida Historical Society. If you're not, you can become a member this evening, and you will get this wonderful tote bag with our logo and the FHSAI logo, the classic Tabot book on the history of Florida, our newsletter, our Florida Historical Quarterly, all sorts of great reasons to become. But of course, the best reason to become a member of the Florida Historical Society is to promote and protect and preserve our great history and all the great projects and programs we have going on. We have an exciting lecture series for the summer coming up, in addition to what you're going to hear tonight on French Florida. The next one is coming up June 20th at 7 p.m. Dr. Lana Williams from the University of Central Florida will be doing a presentation called Tending the Vines, Ancient Wine and Viticulture Practices in Central Anatolia. So it should be an interesting archaeological lecture, part of the FHSAI series. After that, actually, well, a little out of order, our next one is going to be on July 18th at 7 p.m. Roy Laughlin, who's here this evening, and Michael Boonstra will be doing a talk on their new book, Tangible Links to the Past, Coco's Architectural Heritage, 1880 to 1950. Then on July 11th, Dr. Sandra Wheeler at the University of Central Florida will be doing another archaeology FHSAI lecture, Hot Summer Nights, Fertility Practices in Roman Egypt. So a lot of great lectures coming up this summer. Hope we'll see you here for those. But tonight, you've come on a very special night. As I mentioned, the talk of the conference at the annual meeting and symposium down in Fort Lauderdale was French Florida. And the new book that's edited by our Director of Educational Resources, Ben Dibiase, was the talk of the conference. As you'll hear, it's the first English translation of some very important historical documents. And it was premiered just a couple of weeks ago at our conference, and was very popular, and was one of the very first copies was presented to the Consul General of France in Miami. And Ben talked about it there, and I'm sure you're going to be fascinated by the story of this document and how it came to be published, and Ben will tell you all about it in just a moment. I also want to recognize that, as many of you know, our Associate Director, Barbara West, is about to retire. So this is her last presentation that she'll be attending, and so let's give a round of applause for our Associate Director, Barbara West, who's retiring. All right, without further ado, Ben Dibiase, as I mentioned, is Director of our Educational Resources and editor of the book, French Florida, and he's here to tell us all about it. Welcome, Ben.
Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. Feels like I haven't actually left this place yet today. Tonight I'm going to talk, as Ben said, about what I like to think of as an archivist's dream, the rebirth of a lost manuscript that was essentially lost in time. It had sat on the shelves in this archive for over 80 years, and we were able to bring it back to life, republish this narrative, along with some, as Ben said, some very important translations of early 16th century French documents that help to highlight a period in Florida history that, as I'll explain here in a few slides, I feel like is very important to the Florida history narrative, especially in the early colonial period. We still understand very little about the 16th century in Florida, and a lot of that has to do with a lack of documentation. So when we can provide historians and anyone interested in Florida history with a source such as this by republishing it, it's always a great experience. So let me go ahead and get into it. I've been talking a lot about I will be talking a lot about the 16th century. And when I talk about the French period in Florida, it really only lasts for about 4 years, right? Most Florida historians will classify it as being from about 1562 to 1565 until the destruction of Fort Caroline. But French exploration in North America and in the New World actually goes back to the early 16th century. And as you can see here, I've mentioned a few of the more famous French explorers, or those who were exploring the New World at the behest of the French monarch. We have Verrazano, as many of you probably recognize, in 1524, and then later in the 1530s, who traveled back to the New World. Jacques Cartier, who explored part of what is now the northeastern part of North America, the St. Lawrence River, and what is now French Canada, the Quebec provinces, in 1534, and then again in 1541. But the French had, the point I'm trying to make is that the French had tried to colonize and at least explore this new world really for decades prior to the Fort Caroline experiment, we'll call it, in the 1560s. So there's this long history of exploration, naval exploration, on behalf of the French government to explore and eventually colonize the New World. Here we have some images of those two gentlemen. Here is Verrazano and a 19th century oil painting of Cartier. But I want to skip ahead a little bit to the mid-16th century because the activities in Florida and the colonization of Florida tie directly into what's happening in Europe in the mid-16th century. So it's important to kind of get that background first so we can understand why these small French fleets are sailing to the New World and attempting to colonize in this very uninhabitable environment. This is a great map. This is actually a map from the early 17th century, and as you can see, it's fairly accurate map of Europe at the time. Here we're talking about France in turquoise. So one of the biggest movements, and probably the most important movement that would contribute to the eventual exploration of the New World and the establishment of Fort Caroline is what we call the Great Schism, or the Great Protestant, movement in the early to mid 16th century in Europe, and it's actually kind of a pan-Europe movement. But there is a French sect of this religious movement that's important. And that's where we get the birth of what we call the Huguenots. And you'll probably hear me saying that more and more, and I'm sure you've probably heard that term before. But the Huguenots are a group of Protestants who have broken away from this predominantly Catholic-dominated French society. So it's difficult to stress how much of a paradigm shift this schism actually was. So we're talking about centuries of papal domination in Europe, of Catholic domination in Europe. The monarchs, are a product of this vast, power structure. And then you have the gentleman here pictured at the top, Martin Luther, coming up with these new ideas and breaking away from that established religious system. And that's what we call the Great Schism and this great religious movement. And there becomes a rift between the people in Europe, and you get a rift between the powerful families in France. And as a result of that, we get the religious wars in France. And this is small subset of the religious wars of Europe, but again, it all ties back to this great schism in the Christian religion. Because at that time, you have to remember that Christianity and religion was an integral part of life. This was not sort of the casual Sunday affair that we may think of now, but this was really, it enveloped every aspect of life in Europe in the 16th century. So as a result, like I said, of this schism in Europe, you have another gentleman here. This is John Calvin, whose Calvinist teachings were very influential in France specifically, and influenced a lot of the group that would later become the Huguenots to rebel against the established Catholic monarchy in France. And as a result of that, there was a purge in France to rid the countryside of these new Protestants and these new Huguenots. So and over the course of the next century, thousands of people would then flee France to other countries, a lot of them to England and to other places that were more friendly, I guess, to this new style of religion. But there were quite a few who attempted to colonize the New World, and that's where we get the Fort Caroline experiment in the 1560s. Those strong proponents of this new Protestant religion were searching for a new settlement, and the New World was a perfect venue for that. This is an important gentleman in the Fort Caroline story. Many of you who are familiar with some of the back history have probably heard his name. This is, and I'm going to give you a disclaimer first. I'm not a French speaker. So I'll probably butcher most of the pronunciations of these words. This is Gaspard de Coligny, I believe is how it's pronounced. He was actually an admiral in the French Navy. And it was really Coligny who was the foremost proponent of a new settlement, not only in a new area in Europe, but in the New World. And like I'd mentioned before, the French Navy was really at the forefront of a lot of this early exploration into the New World. So being an admiral in the French Navy, he was exposed to some of these early explorations, knew about some of these new settlements, had worked quite a bit with European merchants who were traveling to the New World and to the Caribbean, trading in the Caribbean, and felt like the New World, Florida in particular, Spanish Florida at the time, would be a perfect site for these new settlements. He decided to send a small armada, a small fleet of boats over to North America, but he also sent a small fleet down to Brazil, to South America, they were eventually repelled by the Portuguese, but they did establish a small colony, French colony, Huguenot colony, that existed right outside of Rio de Janeiro for about 15 years before it was destroyed. But at the same time, he sent a gentleman by the name of Jean Ribault to Florida with a small group of about 150, mainly soldiers, to establish a colony in the what was then considered La Florida, or the French or Spanish Florida. Going back a few decades, in 1513, the Spanish had, of course, first laid claim after Ponce de Leon had landed on the shores of Florida, and subsequent Spanish expeditions. They had laid claim to this vast area of land that we now refer to as the southeastern United States as La Florida. Unfortunately, though, none of those settlements had lasted. So there was no permanent European settlement in the continental U.S. at the time. So the French moved in and sort of filled that vacuum when they came to Florida. Coligny was actually killed in Paris. He remained in France. He fought Catherine de' Medici, was the Queen of France at the time, and Coligny became a big, like I said, proponent and sort of the figurehead of the Huguenot movement in France, and fought in a number of major battles during these religious wars in France. And he was eventually shot and killed in the streets of Paris in 1572. But the religious wars are really important. They lasted, like I said, for a few decades, till about 1598. You had very intense fighting, not only in the cities in France, but throughout the countryside. It really controlled the economy and the lives of many who were living in Europe and France during that time. So it was an incredibly important time, and it gives you an idea of why what would motivate a small group of French sailors to get aboard these ships and sail thousands of miles, essentially into the unknown, to settle a new colony in Florida. So here we have the Jean Ribault expedition in 1562. So he arrived in Florida right about this time of year, actually, in 1562, and first sighted land just north of here, near what is now Jacksonville. It was during this expedition that he named a body of water he called the River of May, we now refer to as the St. Johns River, where Jacksonville is now. And he erected, according to the source material, he did erect a stone monument with a fleur-de-lis, some sort of inscription. This monument's never been found, and it's part of the lore of the French in Florida, whether or not it even existed. But according to the source material, and most historians would agree that he probably landed somewhere on the east coast of Florida in mid-1562, but didn't decide to settle in this area. He actually headed north towards the Port Royal Sound, which is now present-day South Carolina, and settled on a small island that we now call Parris Island, where of course, the famous Marine training base is in Parris Island, and did establish a small colony there. Now, at the time, they only had about 150 soldiers, but they did erect a small fort. Ribault knew that they couldn't survive, so he actually loaded up 2 of his ships and decided to sail back to France to raise more soldiers and to hopefully contract a few settlers, artisans and people like that to come back and help develop this colony. And decided to sail back late in 1562, left a small contingency actually at the fort, which he named Charles Fort on Parris Island, and made his way back to France. Now, unfortunately, France was, like I said, enveloped in war, and during the time he had left, he couldn't remain in France. He actually fled to England. He was imprisoned in England for a little while, actually almost a year, about a year and a half, made it back to France. Eventually was able to raise a small force of, again, mainly soldiers to sail back to Florida. But by that time, it was 1564, almost 1565. In the meantime, however, his second-in-command, a gentleman by the name of René Laudonnière, who had sailed with Ribault the first time, sailed back to France with Ribault, remained in France, did not go to England, felt that Ribault had probably been killed, because there actually was a contract for his head, so he was probably he assumed that he was killed in England, and decided to raise his own force and sail back to Florida without Ribault. So he was in command of his own fleet of ships, and he actually made it back to Florida. But he first traveled to Charles Fort, in what is now present-day South Carolina, and found the settlement completely abandoned. Again, accounts vary, but it's very likely that they were either killed by some of the native inhabitants or they had fled. There was a small group of survivors who actually fled south back towards present-day Florida, towards the River of May, and that site that Ribault had originally cited. So Laudonnière decided to head further south and look for survivors. Well, they made it all the way south to what is now present-day Jacksonville, to the River of May, stopped. They did find a few survivors, and they decided to establish a new fort and a new settlement there, which they named La Caroline, which you now call Fort Caroline. There was a fort, but there was also a small settlement that was established there as well. And he established the fort site in about the same time, about May of 1564. And again, there were less than 200 soldiers who were manning this outpost, but they thought that they would be okay. Hadn't seen any signs of any Spanish, but were also concerned about the abandonment of the earlier settlement. Now, this is kind of interesting. In a very short amount of time, a lot happened in this very small rural and wild outpost of Florida. So Laudonnière had established Fort Caroline, but at the same time, Ribault had escaped from the gallows in England, made it back to France, had raised a force of soldiers, and by 1565, he was sailing back to Florida. But they essentially just missed each other. They really didn't know what the other was doing. He knew that there was Laudonnière had made it back to Florida, but had no idea what the status was. He also didn't know that he had established a fort in present-day Jacksonville. But anyway, he made it back to Florida, just in time for Ribault to run into a a force of Spanish sailors under the command of Pedro Menendez de Aviles. And some of you are probably familiar, anyone familiar with Florida history probably knows Pedro Menendez. Menendez was, another military man. He had actually fought in the wars in Italy, he had fought in Spain, was a battle-hardened soldier, if you will, and he was sent actually by King Philip II of Spain to crush this Huguenot settlement in Florida. What's interesting about this particular assignment, if you will, this engagement, was that King Philip had ordered, he wanted no survivors. To King Philip, the French Huguenots were heretics. You know, they were religious heretics, barbarians in his eyes, and should be slaughtered. They were not, couldn't be prisoners of war. They weren't seen, essentially weren't seen as on the same level as the Spanish. So Menendez was sent to Florida with the specific guidelines to destroy and leave no survivors at this small outpost at Fort Caroline. So Menendez made it to Fort Caroline. He'd actually run into a few of La Roncière's ships that were just offshore of the fort. And Menendez actually headed a little bit further south to what is now present-day St. Augustine, and this was 1565. Now, many of you know we're going to be celebrating the 450th anniversary of the establishment of St. Augustine. That anniversary is what I'm talking about, when Menendez headed south and established his own fort and his own colony in what is now present-day St. Augustine. And then he and his forces headed overland to Fort Caroline. They overran the small fort, captured as many Frenchmen as they could. La Roncière's fleet, or Ribault's fleet, excuse me, who had just sailed back to Florida, was caught in a hurricane. Menendez tracked down the survivors of that hurricane, captured all of the Maroons, brought them back towards St. Augustine, and killed all of them, about 200 Frenchmen, murdered them in cold blood. In fact, there's an inlet just south of St. Augustine called Matanzas Inlet, which is Spanish for massacre. And that's just for effect. We got a little sound effects here, make it exciting. I say, yeah. So he murdered all of these Frenchmen. There were a few survivors, Jacques Lemoyne being one of whom, who was an artist, who was along with the La Roncière expedition, who actually made it back to France, and it's their accounts that are translated and used for the narrative of this account. So it's one of there are really only a handful, four actually, French accounts of the eyewitness accounts of what actually happened during these engagements. So like I said, it's an incredibly, it's like an action-packed story in a very small part of the world that most people didn't even know existed. So there's so much going on in Europe, yet there's this very interesting footnote that is Florida, this kind of a microcosm of these religious wars that's happening in the New World and in what is really the beginning of European settlement. Because after the French fort was destroyed, the Spanish maintained a garrison at what then became St. Augustine, and St. Augustine today is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in North America, and that's because of this expedition against the French in 1565. So there are very long-lasting impacts. So it's the failure of this French settlement, as I see here, really equates to centuries of Spanish colonial domination in La Florida, right, in this peninsula and in this part of the world, which, as if you know Florida history, that's very important because the Spanish were mining gold and silver out of Central and South America, and these galleon ships were heading right up past the east coast of Florida across the Atlantic back to Spain. So whoever controlled this peninsula of Florida had an incredible advantage in the centuries to come. And it was because of this very, military engagement in 1565 that we, again, know very little about and really don't understand the long-term implications that we get 3 centuries of Spanish domination in La Florida, or else we would all be speaking French at this time. Again, as I said, some of the key source material, both from the Spanish and the French side, are very hard to come across. There are really only a handful. And although most of them are essentially tell the same story, there are a lot of differences, and that's why it's important to have translated accounts like the one that was republished earlier this year. I now want to get to that story. as I said before, it's always exciting when you can bring a manuscript back to life, but that's never an easy journey. And this manuscript in particular has had really fascinating history all its own. And I'll take a little bit of time and talk about that, that fascinating history. So the gentleman you see pictured here is John B. Stetson. Does anyone recognize that name, Stetson? Of course, the hat. But John B. Stetson's father was the primary benefactor of what is now Stetson University, just north of here in DeLand, Florida. And Stetson was he was a businessman. He had worked with his father. He was actually not from Florida, but he did spend quite a bit of time in Florida. And he became an early proponent of Florida history in the early 20th century. This is right around the time when history as a study is becoming a professional study. You know, we have the development of PhD programs. It becomes more of a methodical scientific study rather than just sort of a popular narrative of the winners of history, so to speak. And John B. Stetson was a big proponent of this move towards a more academic, scientific look at history in the early 20th century, specifically at Florida history. He was fascinated with the early colonial period, with these early Spanish attempts at colonization, the French at Fort Caroline, and subsequent explorations into the interior of Florida. So we had an interest in collecting a lot of primary documentation, because for him and for a lot of these early professional historians, the root of all historical research is in primary documents. And this is really the model that we use today. It's looking at the original source and reinterpreting the original source over and over again, essentially. So for him, it was important to not only locate, identify, but also to provide copies of these original colonial source materials on Florida history, so that Western audiences, but also those who can understand, 16th century Spanish and French, would be able to utilize these sources in their research, and we could better understand, the earliest European settlements in North America. So as a result of that, in 1921, Stetson formed a society known as the Florida State Historical Society, which is a little bit confusing. The Florida Historical Society, as Dr. Brokmarkle pointed out, was actually established in 1856, and this was a contemporary organization. Stetson was a member of the Florida Historical Society. A lot of his members were also members of the Florida Historical Society, but the Florida State Historical Society, their mission was to primarily to foster research in early records and to render accessible scarce historical material by facsimile. So what he really wanted to do was get a group of like-minded scholars together to go out, locate these original documents, and provide facsimiles, make copies, and present them in these wonderful manuscript collections. And he did so for about 10 years. Like I said, started in 1921 till about 1930. They produced a number of these early colonial history works, about 11, usually 2-volume sets that range from early Spanish colonial documents to early territorial period newspapers that were produced in Florida. He made facsimiles of original newspapers that at the time were very hard to find and hard for graduate students to get their hands on. So for him, it was important to make these materials available for the public. This is an example of some of the works. Many of you who have worked in Florida history may recognize some of these titles. Most of these we actually have here at the Library of Florida History. We have first edition copies. Pedro Menendez de Aviles. This is actually Solas de Meras is one of the first-hand accounts that we compare to the French accounts. He was along with Menendez on that 1565 expedition, and he wrote his own interpretation of events. And we actually, as far as the Spanish accounts goes, this is probably one of the closest to original accounts. Territorial Florida newspapers, as I said before. An early history of Florida, which has been revised and changed quite a bit, but is still a foundational work on the history of Florida. And the biography of Jean Ribault. Ribaud was a fascinating character long before he even came to Florida. He had a long career in the French Navy and was involved in a number of major naval engagements in the Mediterranean long before he ever came to Florida. So Jeanette Thurber Connor, who was a founding member of the State Historical Society, wrote a wonderful biography that's still used today as a primary source by anyone researching this time period in Florida history. The problem, unfortunately, with only focusing on publication, as anyone who's involved in a nonprofit might know, is that it gets very expensive. And the market for historical facsimiles of colonial documents was not very strong in the 1920s. It's not very strong now. It's hard to sell. These were, it took a lot of time. It generally took years to produce and transcribe a lot of these documents. And Stetson, he was actually a very wealthy person, and a lot of these early publications were bankrolled by Stetson. By the end of the tenure of the State Historical Society, he had spent somewhere around $100,000, and this is in the 1920s, simply to publish manuscripts like the one that we publish here, French Florida, and the few that I listed before. Although they, amongst the Florida history community, there were a lot of libraries, universities that would buy up these titles because they were important, again, for research purposes. So by 1933, the State Historical Society unfortunately had to cease their publication operations. So even though they were still actively working to transcribe documents, they simply couldn't afford it anymore. And Stetson decided that they needed to find another route for publication, but they unfortunately could not handle it as a small organization of only about 40 people, 40 members at the time. So the State Historical Society approached the Florida Historical Society, approached this organization with the offer to merge collections because the Historical Society had an established library. In fact, a lot of the books we have now were carried over from that original library in the 1930s. And he also wanted to continue with the publications process. So FHS at the time named Stetson the head of publications department, which was kind of a ceremonial title because he really wasn't in charge of much, and FHS didn't have any money to publish any of these elaborate publications. So not much was done. This is an interesting side note for anyone who's maybe been a member of the FHS. This is an inventory that was taken in actually 1936, I believe, of the Florida Historical Society's holdings. But it's also part of the agreement that Stetson laid out when he agreed to merge with FHS. And at the time, the State Historical Society, which was really just John Stetson, owned Turtle Mound. Does anyone know where Turtle Mound is up near New Smyrna? Right, it's a giant, one of the largest shell middens, in Florida, and he owned it, or the State Historical Society owned it. So part of his agreement was that the FHS would take over ownership of that mound. He was also happy to carry on the publishing of the quarterly, the Florida Historical Quarterly, which he did and contributed somewhat to. But he also wanted to hold general meetings around the state, which is part of the mission of the Historical Society today. Here we get to the lost manuscript. And I said before that he had published and actually got to print 11 publications with 2 volumes with each publication. The last one, actually one of the last ones being about Ribaud, but the plan was to publish a survey narrative based on primary sources of the French period in Florida from 1562 to 1565. And he had actually approached a French historian by the name of Charles de La Roncière. And Roncière was well known as a historian of the French Navy. In fact, in 1899, he had begun what would become a 6-volume canon on the French Navy, and it's still referred to that as today. It's one of the primary sources on the history of the French Navy going back to the 15th century. So John Stetson had approached him sometime around 1927 with the idea of writing a small book about the French naval history and their connection to Florida, which would become Floride Française. And he did so, and Stetson actually funded the original French publication, the French language publication, in 1929. And there are a few of those original editions still floating around. In fact, one of which, if you get a chance after the talk, please come up and take a look through it. On the left side of the table, we have one of those original French edition copies. It's in the French language, written by Roncière and published in 1929, funded by the Florida State Historical Society. Another version is actually at the P.K. Young Library of Florida History at the University of Florida. And there are a few other. There's one at the Yale University Library, but only a handful survive. In fact, Roncière was the head curator of the manuscripts department at the National Library in Paris. And they don't even have a copy of this book. So it's very rare and hard to find today. But Stetson also, like I said, part of his mission was to make these sources available to English-speaking audiences. So he wanted to translate the work as well. So they got to work on translating the publication. And that started in about 1930. But as I said, by 1933, they had determined that there was no funding left to publish any more of these books. So French Florida really just happened at the wrong time in the history of the State Historical Society, or else it would have been published 80 years ago. The translation, I say here, became an international affair. You'll notice if you look through the book that there is no specific translator mentioned. That's because it was part of another larger program between the U.S. government and the French government that was established after the First World War. It was called the Inter-Allied Association, Association Inter-Alliée, which, again, I'm just ruining the French language here, but it was established with the express purpose of translating documents between the French language and the English language. Mainly it was government documents that were transferred between the two governments as sort of a friendship and long-lasting diplomatic relationship. But because Roncière worked for the French government as the curator at the National Library, he was able to work a deal and have that office, which had a team of like 30 people, translate his entire work. They did footnotes and everything. They translated everything into English from the original French version. So Stetson never had to do any of the translation. There were actually no members of the State Historical Society involved in the translation. It was a nameless group of French historians and English speakers who translated this work originally into the English version. And that's what you see here is the French Florida. This is the original 1930 English version as it appeared today. And on the right side of the table, I've pulled out the proof copy of what that English translation looked like. So you can actually compare the French and the English and how they would have looked some 80 years ago. Again, with that financial burden on the FSHS, the publication essentially stopped. There were some issues with the office itself, the Inter-Allied office. They had a change in department heads, and it would seem like month after month, year after year. If you go through the correspondence records, you can sort of see the frustration of Stetson and the members of FSHS because they just couldn't get a solid translated copy because they kept sending back edits, and that's why it became an international affair. In fact, in the collection, we have some of the original envelopes that traveled back and forth between Paris and at that time, Yale University, where Stetson was, a number of times between 1930 and 1933. So it was because of these issues with time that the publication was never actually published. In fact, this is an example of one of those envelopes that were saved in the collection. So here we are. We have a manuscript that was translated into English by a group of French scholars back in between 1930 and 1933. We have a final version, what we call an office proof or a copy proof, that was ready to go to print. It was laid out exactly how they would have liked it in a large format, almost a folio size, on thick cotton paper, along with some reproductions, hand-colored reproductions of the Theodore de Bry engravings from the 1590s. It would have been a beautiful book, and it would have been quite a production. It really would have been a great cap, I think, to the FSHS, but unfortunately it just didn't happen. So this manuscript was transferred to the Florida Historical Society Library. This is right before the Second World War. There were a lot of issues, again, internally with FHS. They had changes in in directorship and changes in the presidency, so it was never published. And this manuscript just went up into the archives, and like a million other manuscripts around the world sat on a shelf somewhere and essentially wasn't seen until about 2010. We had an intern here who was working on, interested in colonial Florida history topics, found this manuscript, collected all of the associated correspondence records between Stetson and between Roncière and everyone else who was involved in this massive project. And we started to see the scope of a project lost, something that essentially made it so far and then was abandoned. So for us, and with 2014 being the 450th anniversary of the establishment of Fort Caroline, we wanted to, again, bring this manuscript back to life. So how do we do it? And this became probably the most difficult part, was the mechanics of actually digitizing a document that was typed up and is also covered in handwritten notes that's over 80 years old. It's incredibly fragile and takes quite a bit of time. Again, the original was a larger format, large in about 9 by 12. And there were all of these small pencil and pen marks throughout the manuscript. And it was difficult. The option was to retype the entire manuscript, along with all the footnotes, the endnotes, the captions, and then integrate all of these errors. But the decision was made to digitize it using OCR software, and some of you are probably familiar with it. It's now become kind of a standard procedure, although it's very difficult and very finicky. And OCR software essentially takes a digital image, so a scanned page, if you will, of a document, and will search that document for recognizable characters in different languages, in this case in English, looking for different characters, and then we'll reformat that and turn it into a plain text format. We then converted that from plain text to a rich text into a Microsoft Word format, and then began a long process of going line by line and editing through an entire manuscript. So it sounds easy, and to me I thought it was easy. I said, we've got a couple of months, OCR it, and it'll be great, and just spit out a book. Absolutely doesn't happen that way. And this project, even though my name is on the front of the book, this project wouldn't have happened without the help of a lot of people. In fact, we have a few of them here tonight. One of our interns, Terry Hooker, did the actual scanning. And scanning, again, sounds very easy, but it's page by page. Everything has to be laid out properly. We have to check every page. We're talking about almost 300 pages of documents and of images that had to be laid out and properly scanned. And then we had another volunteer, Kirsten Russell, who wasn't here tonight, who sat at the computer for hours and hours. Literally, it took hundreds of hours between the three of us, between Kirsten, Chris Galloway, who's another one of our volunteers, and luckily is also a fluent French speaker, who was able to help us when we missed the accent marks and couldn't pronounce any words. Hundreds of hours to sit at the computer and go through pages and pages of documents. A few of the documents were actually typewritten. Some of them were covered up with this nonsense and the shorthand pencil corrections that were on top of the typescript. We were able to supplement with an actual typewriter, cleaner typescript that was part of the original collection. And sometimes that would help to help speed the process along. But this is a great example of what comes out of OCR. Again, just to give you an idea of how difficult it is to read. This makes no sense to anyone. You can't read this. This is if I were to pull open the open page, it's just a standard English, text. There's a title up here. We had a space. The one wasn't even there. Not even sure where that came from. And then you have spaces where there shouldn't be spaces, and it didn't recognize, especially a lot of the French language accent marks and the Spanish accent marks. So all of these changes had to be made by hand, and that's what contributed to the overall amount of work that went into creating the book itself. So this is the final product, and again, if you'd like to come up and look at it here on the table, the original French Florida, as you can see here on the left. And this is what the digital portion came out to look like eventually. So we tried to replicate it as close to the original as possible. Because like I said, this narrative, and I didn't want to give away a whole lot because it's a really great read, and it's the way that Roncière laid it out with subsections, you can read through it quite quickly. And it plays out just like an incredible fictional novel. But it's again based on a lot of those early firsthand accounts, the originals of which are in the National Library in Paris that he drew upon to come up with this narrative. So even though it was published 80 years ago, it's a part of the historiography that is quite well done when we look at colonial Florida histories, and it's, again, a really fascinating read. The second half of this, the second part, rather, of this publication is the reproduction of the Debray engravings. And the Debray engravings, many of you are familiar with, Florida history and anthropology, have seen these before. They're important because they've shaped the way that we look at Native Americans and the way that subsequent Europeans coming to the New World viewed Native Americans in Florida for centuries. Today, a lot of historians and anthropologists will dismiss the engravings as really being more an amalgamation of different stories and source material coming from different parts of the world to describe Florida Indians. They also integrated a lot of, if you look at the images, you'll see they're posed much like Europeans, and how an artist in the 16th century would depict Europeans in terms of stature and dress and things like that. But they were probably utilizing some of the early testimonies of what life was like in Fort Caroline and what it was like to interact with some of these native peoples, but they can't be used as literal depictions. Much like this narrative and the original first-hand accounts, we have to look at it with a fine-tooth comb, and we have to compare all of them together to get a general idea of what actually happened in 1562 and then again in 1565. And this work, I think, is an important first step, I think, in that process. So anyone who is unfamiliar with this fascinating chapter in Florida history, this is a great first read to sort of get you excited about and interested in this really incredible expedition by the French and the Spanish in the mid-16th century that really started European settlement in North America, in Florida specifically. The end of the book, the last two appendices, we've included some original 16th century French language and then English translations of accounts of a couple of expeditions. One was done by Jacques Lemoyne, the famous narrative of the 1565 account. The second is of an expedition that took place in 1567, and many people aren't familiar with this. A gentleman by the name of Dominique de Gourgues, who was actually a French mercenary, if you will. Many scholars disagree as to his actual religion. They don't know if he was Catholic. He may have even been a Protestant, or probably, whether he was Catholic or Protestant, he cared little about religion. To him, he wanted to come back to Florida and revenge the massacre that had happened in 1565. Dominique de Gourgues was actually imprisoned by the Spanish for a few years and was a prisoner aboard a few of their ships in the Mediterranean. So he had some other issues with the Spanish, but he was able to raise a small force in France, sailed back to Florida in 1567, landed just north of present-day Jacksonville, probably around the St. Mary's River. From his accounts, he was able to round up a few of the native groups. Whether or not that happened, we're really still not sure, but we know he had a force of about 200 French and other national mercenaries, headed back down to what was Fort Caroline. The Spanish had renamed Fort San Mateo, and the French essentially laid siege to the very small force of only about 75 Spanish who were garrisoned at the fort. And of the survivors of the original attack, he hung from a tree, like Menendez had done to the Spanish, to the French rather, the Huguenots a few years earlier. And then he rounded up his soldiers, and they headed out. And actually, he spent a little bit of time around the Caribbean as well, raiding a few ships and working essentially as a pirate before heading back to France. And of course, the French king condemned it, but the French monarch did as well, and said, well, he's sort of acting outside of the French, monarch. But two, Dominique de Gourgues, it was worthwhile, and his name sort of went down in French lore, as the corsair of vengeance. But this original account that he wrote himself and published in 1568 is replicated here in the appendix of this book. So you can read in his own hand what this expedition was like, along with the English translations. You really get a feel of for his for the temperament of the time and the reasons for coming back to Florida. Because again, you have to think about the expedition itself, sailing thousands of miles, over, again, uncharted waters into, you really had no idea what. There were still large native communities that were living in this area, and your chances of survival were slim. So to mount an attack like this, it took an incredible amount of motivation, and de Gourgues was, really an interesting person for coming back. But again, he went down in French history as this great and grand corsair and this mercenary. But whether or not what his motives were, it really just kind of makes an interesting footnote for the end of the book to kind of keep the story going in early colonial Florida history. So I'll probably end it there. Does anyone have any questions about the? Yes, ma'am.
Without going into the book, I was just wondering, do you have any information or can you share with us some reasons why some were able to survive the massacre?
It's interesting, and there's I wondered that myself, and it doesn't seem like many historians have gone into that, because there were only about 4 Frenchmen who survived that attack on the Fort Caroline. How they got back to France, too, I'm still not really sure. I believe there are some accounts that say that they built a boat and sailed across the Atlantic, which is very unlikely. But it's interesting that we do know that there were a few survivors, and they survived in the wilderness of Florida. But it was only a handful. The majority of the Frenchmen during that first expedition were, if they weren't killed during the first attack on the fort, they were killed at Matanzas and then strung from trees in the wilderness. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know how they got back. I don't know how they got back to Europe. But it's those accounts that we rely on, along with official accounts from the Spanish government. Menendez wrote back to the Spanish crown with meticulous, detailed accounts of what had transpired in Florida. And Menendez is, most historians would argue, is probably the most reliable source. Even between the French and Spanish accounts, he probably gave the most even-handed account of what actually transpired here in Florida. Roy?
When you were going from the French to the English, did you distinguish between direct translation and interpretation during that?
Not much. We essentially relied on the translation that was done in the 30s. I mean, there's very little translation that we did at all. If anything, it was really just for clarification.
But those comments didn't have to do with interpretation. They were just
Right. Exactly. Yeah, we tried to really just clarify the document so that it was readable. But the corrections that were made on the 1930 edition were essentially grammatical. They changed the date, a few format issues, and things like that. But once the translation was done, probably around 1932, they were satisfied with the translation. That's the translation that we went with. And because we decided to publish the French edition of the 1567 Revenge attack, anyone who has any experience with 16th century French language would be happy to go through and can probably find some variations in the translation, because of course the translation from 80 years ago would probably be very different today, I'd imagine. So that's why we wanted to include the original French version, because me not being a scholar of colonial studies, but also of the French language, we really just wanted to provide that source material and essentially just get it out there, and then leave it to someone else to translate decades from now, I hope. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. I also didn't mention, but the color cover that you see in the plastic was the original cover that was sent with the office proof. So that's would have been published, and that's what we actually replicated for the cover of this book. And this was hand drawn in the 1920s for the original Roncière account. So, all right, thank you.